They were sitting on my couch, holding hands, when I walked through the front door. My husband, fingers laced together like it was the most natural thing in the world. And before I could even set down my bag after a 12-hour shift, my husband looked up at me with this calm, almost rehearsed smile and said, "We've been waiting for you. We need to talk about something important." I remember thinking, in that one suspended second before the world cracked open, that maybe someone had died. Maybe there was bad news about a family member. Maybe something had gone wrong with the lease. I never once imagined that the two people I trusted most on this earth were about to ask me to share my own marriage with the woman I had called my best friend since we were 17 years old. And I never imagined that they had already been sharing it without asking me for an entire year. But let me back up. Because if you're going to understand why what I did next was not cruelty, not pettiness, not some scorned woman losing her mind, if you're going to understand why every single thing I did was completely, methodically, and beautifully justified, then you need to know who these people were to me. And you need to know exactly how deep the betrayal actually went. My name is Mara. I'm 30 years old. At the time this happened, I was working as a project manager at a logistics company, pulling anywhere from 50 to 60 hours a week, sometimes more when we had a big contract cycle closing. My husband Daniel was 33. We had been married for 4 years, together for 6. He was a freelance graphic designer, which sounds glamorous until you realize that for the last 2 years of our marriage, the freelance work had slowed to almost nothing. He had 1 or 2 small clients, a couple of logo projects here and there, but nothing that generated real income. I told myself it was a rough patch. I told myself he was talented and the market was just slow. I covered the mortgage. I covered the groceries. I covered the utilities, the streaming subscriptions, the car insurance on both our vehicles, the gym membership he used twice a month. I covered all of it. And I did it without resentment, because that is what you do when you love someone. You carry them when they can't carry themselves, and you trust that they'll do the same for you someday. And then there was Priya. Priya had been my best friend since junior year of high school. We had been through everything together. Bad breakups, family losses, cross-country moves, career pivots. She was the maid of honor at my wedding. She gave a speech that made half the room cry, including me. About a year and a half before all of this happened, Priya had gone through a brutal divorce of her own. Her ex had cleaned out their savings, she'd had to break her lease, and she had nowhere to go. She called me sobbing at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night, and without even consulting Daniel, which I realize now was naive of me, I told her she could come stay with us. Just until she got back on her feet, she could have the guest room. We had the space. She moved in the following weekend. She brought 3 suitcases, and a gratitude that felt so genuine it still makes me sick to think about. She cooked dinner twice a week. She helped with errands. She was warm and present and funny and everything I remembered her being. And I was happy. I was genuinely happy to have her there. I thought I had built something rare, a home full of people who loved each other. I had no idea I was building a nest for 2 people who were already betraying me. The first sign I missed was so small, I almost feel embarrassed to mention it now. About 8 months into Priya living with us, I came home early from work one Friday afternoon. A meeting had been canceled, and the apartment was quiet. Daniel's car was in the driveway. Priya's was, too. I assumed they were both just in their respective spaces. I went to the kitchen to make tea, and maybe 10 minutes later they both appeared from the hallway that led to the bedrooms, talking and laughing about something, and when they saw me they both went quiet for just a beat too long. Daniel said they'd been watching a movie in the living room and he'd gone to get a snack. Priya said she'd been napping. Neither of those things explained why they were both coming from the same direction at the same time, but I didn't ask. I let it go. I let it go 6 or 7 more times over the next few months, a text tone that Daniel silenced a little too quickly. Priya laughing at an inside joke I wasn't part of. The way they sometimes finished each other's sentences in a way that felt less like friendship and more like something practiced in private. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that, of course, they had grown close. They lived together, they were both home during the day while I was working. It made sense that they would bond. I actively talked myself out of my own instincts. And that, more than anything else, is the part that still stings. But here's the thing about the truth. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. It finds its own moment. About 3 weeks before the night on the couch, I was traveling for work. A 2-day conference about 4 hours away. I had planned to stay both nights at the hotel, but the second day wrapped up early and I decided to drive home instead of paying for an extra night. I didn't text ahead. I just drove. I walked into my apartment at 9:30 in the evening and the lights were low and there was music playing, soft, the kind of music you put on when you want a mood, and before I even made it past the entryway, I could see through the open bedroom door. My bedroom door, the door to the room I shared with my husband. I don't need to describe exactly what I saw. You already know. What I will tell you is that neither of them heard me come in. And what I will tell you is that I stood there for a moment that felt like it stretched across years, and something inside me that had been quietly bending for months finally, completely and permanently broke. I walked back out the front door. I sat in my car in the parking garage for 2 hours. I cried until I couldn't, and then I stopped. And somewhere in that silence, sitting in the dark with my hands in my lap, something shifted. The grief didn't disappear, but something else moved in beside it. Something cold and clear and very, very focused. I did not go back inside that night. I drove to a hotel and I checked in under my own name with my own card, and I lay on a strange bed and I started making a list. Here is what I knew. I owned the apartment. My name was the only name on the lease. I had signed it before Daniel and I were married, and when we renewed it, I had kept it in my name because Daniel's credit score at the time was too low to be added. That had never changed. Priya's name was not on the lease either. She was a guest, nothing more. I was also the primary account holder on every joint financial account Daniel and I shared. I had added him as an authorized user, but the accounts were mine. I had opened them before we married. I had maintained them. I had funded them almost entirely on my own for the last 2 years. I also knew that if I walked back into that apartment and exploded, if I screamed and threw things and demanded they leave that night, Daniel would lawyer up, claim marital assets, and drag me into a process that could take months and cost me significantly. I needed to be smarter than my anger. I needed to let them think they still had the upper hand. So I went back home the next morning like nothing had happened. I told them the conference had run long and I'd stayed the extra night after all. I watched their faces carefully and I saw the relief pass through both of them like a wave, and I smiled and made coffee and I played my role perfectly. And then I called a lawyer. Her name was Carmen, and she had been recommended to me by a colleague who had gone through her own divorce 2 years prior. I met with Carmen 3 days after the night I came home early, and I laid out everything. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she looked at me and said, "You're in a very strong position, but we need documentation." So I documented. I had already noticed that Daniel and Priya used a shared photo storage app, one of those cloud services where photos back up automatically. Daniel had once shared access with me so I could pull vacation photos. He had never revoked that access. Over the next several days, I quietly downloaded everything I needed. More than enough. I also pulled bank statements going back 18 months, which showed that during the period Priya had been living with us, Daniel had been making small cash withdrawals. Nothing dramatic, but consistent. 20 here, 40 there. Enough to take someone to lunch. Enough to buy flowers. Enough to build a secret life inside the walls of my home. Carmen told me we had what we needed. She filed the preliminary paperwork. She advised me on how to handle the accounts. And then she told me something that I turned over in my mind for 2 days straight before I decided she was absolutely right. Let them show you exactly who they are one more time before you move. People like this almost always will. She was right. 3 days later, they sat me down on my couch. I want you to sit with that for a moment. After a year of lying to my face, after sleeping in my bed while I was at work paying for every square foot of the roof over their heads, after using my home, my money, my trust, my friendship, after all of that, they sat me down and they held hands and they proposed, with complete sincerity, that I might want to join them. That we could all three be together. That it could be beautiful, which was the actual word Daniel used. Beautiful. Priya said she still loved me, that this didn't have to be a loss, that people did this all the time now, and it worked. She said she had never wanted to hurt me. She said she hoped I could see this as an opening rather than a wound. I looked at both of them for a long moment. And then I said, that's a lot to take in. Can you give me a few days to think about it? The relief on their faces was almost pitiful. Daniel reached over and squeezed my hand. Priya said, of course, take all the time you need. They genuinely believed I was considering it. They genuinely believed that I was so accustomed to carrying them, so conditioned to absorbing whatever they needed, that I would fold this into my life too. That I would make room. That I would pay for the privilege of being the third wheel in my own marriage. They had mistaken my patience for weakness for a very long time. They were about to learn the difference. I gave it exactly 6 days. 6 days of normal. 6 days of dinners and small talk, and letting them believe the ground was solid beneath their feet. And on the 7th day, I was ready. I had already moved the bulk of my personal savings into a new account that Daniel had no access to. Carmen had advised me to do this carefully and within legal parameters, which I did. I moved only what was demonstrably mine, documented every transfer, and left the joint account with a balance that reflected exactly what Daniel had contributed to it, which was almost nothing. I had also spoken to my building manager and confirmed in writing that Priya had no tenancy rights whatsoever. She was an informal guest. She could be asked to leave with reasonable notice, and given the circumstances, the building manager agreed that the notice could be short. On a Thursday morning, while both of them were still asleep, I left for work as usual. By 10 o'clock, a process server had arrived at the apartment. Daniel received divorce papers. Priya received a formal eviction notice, giving her 72 hours to vacate the premises. Both documents arrived at the same time, delivered by the same person, which I admit was a small touch I had specifically requested from Carmen and which she had laughed about before agreeing to arrange. I got a call from Daniel at 10:17. I let it go to voicemail. I got a call from Priya at 10:19. I let that go too. Over the next 2 hours, I received 14 missed calls between the two of them and a series of text messages that cycled through shock, confusion, anger, pleading, and then anger again. Daniel's text told me I was being insane, that I was overreacting, that we could talk about this. Priya's text told me she was sorry, that she loved me, that I didn't have to do this. I read every single one of them. I saved them all, and I did not respond to a single word. By the end of that week, Daniel had moved into a friend's spare room with 2 suitcases and a dawning awareness that the life he had been coasting through was no longer available to him. Priya had called 3 different people trying to find a place to stay, and as far as I know, she ended up in an extended stay motel for several weeks while she figured out her next move. Neither of them had significant savings. Neither of them had been building anything during the year they had been building each other. They had been entirely dependent on me, and they had burned that dependency to the ground with their own hands. The divorce was finalized several months later. Because we had been married under 4 years and the financial documentation was so clearly in my favor, Daniel walked away with very little. He contested a few things, as Carmen had predicted he would, but the evidence I had gathered made his position difficult to sustain. He eventually stopped fighting. I kept the apartment. I kept my accounts. I kept my career, my stability, and my future. What I lost was harder to quantify. I lost 6 years of marriage that I had believed in completely. I lost the version of Daniel I had fallen in love with, or maybe I lost the illusion that that version had ever fully existed. I lost Priya, not just the person she turned out to be, but the person I thought she was. The 17-year-old girl who had been my closest friend, the woman who stood beside me at my wedding and cried real tears. Or maybe those tears were real. Maybe you can love someone and still do what she did. I honestly don't know. What I know is that I can't carry that question forever, and I've made peace with setting it down. People sometimes ask me if I regret how I handled it, if I should have confronted them immediately, had it out, given them a chance to explain, and I always say the same thing. They had a year of chances to explain. They had a year of mornings and evenings and ordinary days when either of them could have come to me with the truth. They chose, every single day for 12 months, to look me in the eye and lie. The proposal on the couch wasn't a confession. It was a negotiation. They weren't coming to me with honesty. They were coming to me with an offer that would let them keep everything they had taken while I kept paying for it. I didn't blow up my life out of rage. I rebuilt it out of clarity. There is a difference, and it matters. I'm 30 years old. I have a good job, a stable home, and a slowly rebuilding sense of what I actually want my life to look like. I have a therapist I see every other week who has helped me understand why I was so willing to absorb so much for so long, and that work is ongoing and uncomfortable and necessary. I have a small group of friends who know the whole story and who showed up for me in ways I didn't expect. Dinners dropped off, phone calls that lasted 2 hours, one friend who drove 4 hours just to sit with me on a weekend when I told her I was struggling. I don't have a best friend anymore. Not the kind I thought I had. But I'm learning that the absence of a false thing is not the same as emptiness. Sometimes it's just space. Space that belongs to you. Space that hasn't been claimed yet. And I'll tell you this much. The next person who gets that space is going to have to earn it. Because I now know, in a way I didn't before, exactly what it costs to give it away to the wrong people. If you're watching this, and you're carrying someone who is quietly taking more than they give, I want you to hear this. Your patience is not a personality flaw. Your willingness to support the people you love is not weakness. But there is a version of generosity that slowly teaches the people around you that you are inexhaustible, that you will absorb anything, that your limits don't exist. And some people, not all people, but some, will take that lesson and they will use it. Know your limits. Document everything. And when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time, even when it breaks your heart to do it. I believed them. Eventually,